First of all, thank you for attending our November session of the Veterans Open Roundtable. I'm your moderator for the evening. My name is Jim Wanberg, or if you knew me 50 years ago, it would have been Staff Sergeant Jim Wanberg at RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk, England. That's where I spent 3 years of my tour. It was an awful nice place to be because that was during Vietnam and they weren't shooting at it. A couple of things I'd like to touch on real briefly. We all believe that I think we all got the same start. I think we all started with boot camp. Is that a fair statement? All of us that are veterans? And we all started with the same haircut? And then they might have given you some uniforms. And then they taught you how to march. And at some point they probably handed you a rifle. It might have been an M1 Garand, it might have been an M1 carbine, it might have been an M14, or it might have been an M16. And for a few of us, it was a 1911 pistol. So at that point, we're all pretty much the same. We got the same clothes, the same haircut, and we're all qualified with a firearm. And at that point, our careers probably went a lot of different directions. And the two major directions, I would say, would be, first of all, in the front lines, and the second group would be behind the front lines. Tonight you're going to hear from a gentleman that supported us in behind the lines, which is equally important to supporting a military organization. In the World War II, it took 8 guys to keep 1 guy in the front with bullets. And they say today it's 10 plus because of the technology that we have. So there's a lot of military careers that are extremely important as far as behind the lines careers. And I wanted to do a quick survey here. How many guys that how many veterans here would say that they were in the front lines? I count about 3. So that means that the rest of you, or the other 8, you were supporting those 3 guys that were in the front lines. And that's you know, moving a military organization around is a logistic nightmare. Trying to move people and to move all the support people. Now, Mark is going to talk us about one of the support items that we had as a military group, and that was called a PX. Now, we got our uniforms and we got our rifles or pistols, and a lot of the stuff was issued to us. But beyond that, you had to buy toothpaste, you had to buy clean t-shirts or new t-shirts or whatever, and you had to buy a gift for your wife on occasion to send home or to your mom, and you had to have someplace to buy that. And at this point, what I'd like to do is introduce Mark Rasmussen. Mark is a 4-year veteran. 3 years he spent in Japan, and this was only 6 years after the Second World War. So he's in the occupation. The occupation of Japan, I believe, was from 45 to 53. And it switched over during his career from occupation to Security? Okay. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Mark Rasmussen, and we'll let him pick up on his presentation from this point forward. Mark,
thank you. Well, first of all, I was born on a farm south of town. My grandmother was a midwife, and so she delivered me. I went to school, country school, District 22, and then I went to the high school. And the post office had sent out a letter to all the graduating boys at that time, and that they were giving a test to work at the post office. And I had just graduated from high school, and I didn't want to take another test. So I sort of poo-pooed it, and my dad says, go ahead and take the test. You don't have to take the job if you don't want it. Well, I took the test, and it ended up that they hired, this was in 1950, they hired the top 3. There was 40 of us that took the test. They hired the top 3, and I was one of those top 3. And we worked, I think, about 6 months. And I remember working at the post office. I delivered mail on Christmas Day on North Oak Street in a snowstorm. I remember that. But anyway, the 3 of us decided that the Army was getting pretty close, and we might be called into the Army. We didn't want to go in the Army, the three of us, so we enlisted in the Air Force. Well, we were told that we probably would never have to go overseas. Well, that was a mistake right there. But I remember coming back afterwards, after I'd been overseas, and I came back and was going to tell that guy that I went overseas, but he was overseas, so I took care of that. But anyway, I never saw those, because of the fact that Sioux County at that time was only sending one person up to go into the Air Force at that time per month, and so we were broken up. We never were able to go, the three of us together. And I don't think the two of them, I have never really talked to face-to-face since. I correspond with them, but we have, one lives in Iowa and one lives in Phoenix. The basic training, and this was sort of funny too, I joined the Air Force, but the only time I flew was from Minneapolis to San Antonio. After that, it was troop train or troop ship. I never flew again. And I complained about it, and one of the officers said, well, you know, it takes 7 people on the ground to put 1 in the air. And I said, well, I must be one of those 7 people on the ground then. So taking a basic training in San Antonio, and of course they give you tests there to find out what you were proficient in. And I scored high in the radar, and in radio operator, and in office management. Well, when it came time for me to go on to school from basic training, the radar and the radio schools were filled. So I was sent to the office management. And that was in Tempe, Arizona, at Arizona State University. It was State College at that time, but it's a state university now. And I went to school there and had 30 days leave to go home after I finished that course. And then I headed out to Oakland, California. In between that time, when I was in Arizona, my wife-to-be came down to visit me down in Arizona. And so I took an afternoon off to show her around Tempe and Phoenix and so forth. And that was the afternoon that you could choose where you wanted to go overseas. Well, when I got back, there was nothing left but Japan. I would have probably chosen Germany or something like that, but so that's why I ended up in Japan. So I spent 30 days in Oakland, California while we were waiting for enough troops to arrive there so they could fill the troop ship to go over to Japan. And I remember being shipped out from San Francisco and going underneath this Golden Gate Bridge on my 20th birthday. And it was a thing that you threw a penny in the bay. And so as we went under the Golden Gate Bridge, we threw a penny in the ocean. And it took a good 10 days to get over to Japan. And I remember the ships that we went through 2 storms, I think, while we were going over there, and the old ship would tip, and you could look straight down and right into the water. But I remember, especially eating in the galley, you stood when you ate at a narrow table, and it went across the room. And when the ship would trip, you had a tray, and that tray would slide down to that end, and you'd have to wait until the ship tipped the other way before to get your meal back unless you hung onto your tray. So you learned to hang onto your tray. And one thing I learned too, that in order to not get seasick, there always was a man standing as you left the mess hall with either apples or oranges. And I learned one thing, that if you keep something on your stomach in between meals, you don't get as seasick. And so I didn't get seasick at all. It's at the end. Okay. Going over to the Japan, we went across the international date line, of course, and we got a certificate. There it is, a certificate for going across the international date line. So one way you lost a day, and the next time back, the other way you gained a day. So everybody on board ship got a certificate like that. But I learned one thing: don't volunteer for anything on ship. I volunteered to work in the galley. And I went down there, and my job was to clean the great big container that they had made oatmeal in, and it was quite deep, and you had to stick your head down in it to clean the oatmeal out. Well, I did get the feeling pretty sick, and so I up onto the deck right away to get some fresh air, and I never went back. I don't know who cleaned it, but I didn't clean it. But I learned not to volunteer for any duty like that. I was assigned to the 6101st Air Base Group in Nagoya, Japan. Nagoya was the third largest city at that time. I don't know, it might have changed now, but that was back in the 50s. So Nagoya was the third largest city. And the city of Nagoya was our base. And we didn't have any confines. Nagoya was bombed with incendiary bombs, and so most of the homes were burned because they were made of wood and straw and things that would burn. The bigger buildings, the brick buildings or cement buildings, didn't burn, and so a lot of the bigger buildings were still there. And like I said, I was 6101st Air Base Group. There was a 6101st Air Base Wing, which was a little higher than ours. And then, of course, there was the 5th Air Force. And they had the big headquarters at the base there. There was an airstrip, and that was called Kamaki Airstrip, and that was just outside of the city of Nagoya. And I got out there only once or twice, because of the fact that I was working with the PX, and I was sent to work in the PX building, the post exchange, or the military store. And that was my first assignment over there. And I remember I had to take a Jeep and had a Japanese driver, and I had to have on a pistol on my side, and we would pick up all the proceeds for the PXs, because not only had the large PX that I worked in, but we had a hospital PX, we had a bowling alley PX, and we had the PX at Kamaki Airstrip. And so we had to pick up the proceeds from those things and bring it back. That only happened once or twice, and then they decided they could trust the Japanese people to do that. So I never had to do that again. One of my jobs as was the office manager for the PX. One of my jobs there was to make a fire check once a month. And of course, I had two bosses, one military and one civilian. I don't know if you got, Major Barnes was my military boss, and Mr. Epps was my civilian boss, although he was working there as a purchaser for the merchandise that was in the PX. And but they have paper plates on the top of their heads because they both were bald. And I don't remember, there was some celebration that they had a cake there, and it might have been one of them, their birthdays. There were many duties that I had to do weekly and monthly. I remember having a big wooden plaque on the wall of my office with the days of the week, and then they had nails, and they had little notes on each one as to what I had to do that day. And we had 250 Japanese people working for us in the PX. The PX was 5 floors high, and the first 3 floors were merchandise. The 4th one was offices, and then the 5th one was there's the American Red Cross up there, and there was a photo shop up there, so it was other things besides just the selling. of the items that were in the PX. Now, in the PX, of course, we had everything you can think of. There's a picture of one of the floors. Anything that the military might need, and a lot of gifts to send home. They had watches, they had cameras, clothes, just about anything you can think of for the military needs. And I was in charge of typing up the contracts for the concessionaires. We had 3 Japanese concessionaires that came into and sold things within the PX. And one of them was oysters. And you could pick out the oyster you wanted and buy it. And then they would open the oyster for you. And if there's a pearl in it, that became yours. And then they had a man that he would take any picture that you might have, and he'd paint that picture on silk for you, and then frame it for you. And also, I remember, and I still have it, I think, it was the life cycle of the silkworm. It was on glass, and then it had a dome glass over the top. So it had the eggs of the silkworm, and it went all through the life cycle of the earthworm, the silkworm, until it got to the cocoon, where they could make their silk. And of course, a lot of silk was made and purchased in Japan. There were other military people working in the PX. We had a warehouse man, and he took care of the merchandise as it came in and made sure that it got to the right floor. Nagoya had a large hospital. It was one of the largest hospitals outside of the continental United States, and this is why we were there, because the wounded from Korea, if they could be transported, were sent over to our hospital from Korea by helicopter. And then the hospital had everything in it that you can imagine. The eye doctor, the dentist, all was in the hospital there, and it was kept pretty busy. I lived in a billets that was about almost the length of 2 football fields. It was a Japanese officers' billets. And I remember getting put in that. When I first came, I was on the 2nd floor, and I was in a group, a bigger room that held about 4 guys. And I remember it was Olympic time, and we had rats that would run on the ceiling of that building, and they would run, you can hear them running, and then they'd come down to the end and they'd screech, their nails would screech as they would turn the corner, and so we called it the Japanese Olympics. They did finally fumigate it and got rid of the rats. So, but then later on I got downstairs where I got a room just with one other person, and we had our cot, and one thing that I remember too was we call them papasans. It was older gentlemen that would, from the Japanese, that would come and clean your room for you, and they would take your laundry to the laundromat and have it cleaned and bring it back to you, and it was like $2 a month we paid them. But, you know, to them, it was a lot. So they did a lot for us that way. There was an office in this big village that I was in, and it had a post office in it, and it also had manicures that if you wanted to get our fingernails polished and cut, they would do that. They had a haircut. The barber was in there too. So it was quite a long thing. One thing that I noticed, especially when I first got to Japan, there was the smell of Japan. It was so different than it was here in the United States. And I later on found out why, because at night when it got just starting to turn dark, there'd be the noodle vendors. They'd pull a little cart on and with 2 wheels or maybe 4 wheels. They'd pull it, and they have noodles that you could buy, but they played flutes. So when you heard the flute playing, you knew the noodle vendor was coming. And about the food, we were told, don't ever buy any food that is in the ground, like carrots, potatoes, and things like that, because they fertilize with human waste. So we were told not to buy any local vegetables that were in the ground. And as it turned night too, I remember a little. Well, the best way to explain it was a little shop would set up about the size of an outdoor buffet, and it'd have room for 2 people to sit, and then the person that was doing the preparing for you. And I was wondering what they did, so I just stood off in the distance and watched them, and noticed that they had birds hung by the necks along the outside of that building. And I thought, what are they going to do? So you go in and sit down, and they would take the bird that you wanted, and they would pluck off the feathers and put a skewer in it, and they'd cook it for you. But these birds were sparrows. And to me, a sparrow is a dirty bird anyway. And then just the thought of eating sparrows, oh. Although I ate a lot of things there, but not a sparrow. We had one thing, if you go to a nice restaurant, the first thing that you see in front of your plate, and they did have knives and forks for us, for the Americans, but there's a little saucer right ahead of your plate, and it had a raw egg in it, and you were supposed to chug-a-lug that raw egg as an appetizer. That's something I couldn't do either. But I did try octopus and squids and a lot of those foods, and they were good. The octopus was a little chewy, but it had a good flavor to it. And I learned how to make sukiyaki. That's beefsteak cut real thin and cooked in a wok with vegetables and using soy sauce. But you know, I tried to make it over here in the United States, and the soy sauce is so much different here. It didn't taste the same as it did over there. But now we have an Asian outlet up in Minneapolis where you can buy Asian foods like that. So you can get that now, but at the time I didn't have that. But it was still good. One thing too we had to get used to was if you went to a movie theater, and they showed a lot of American movies, and they had captions in Japanese. So, but there'd be the biffies, the women's bathroom and the men's bathroom. But the thing about it was, when you opened the door, it was all one inside. That was sort of hard to get used to. And also, they had some little wooden. Not wooden, they had cement sheds out on the gutter, and they were also toilets that could be used. But I never used any of those. But anyway, so there were a lot of things that was a lot different than it was here in the United States. There would be a beggar that would stop by because I never used a Japanese streetcar because that was always filled with people, and it was like trying to get into a sardine can. So there was just too many people. So, but the military had the buses that would go from place to place, and military buses, and so we always used those. But they'd have little stops for the bus stops, and there's a little old man that would come and begged there. He was a short little man. Clothes was very bad and torn, dirty, and he'd beg for yen, and so we'd toss him a few yen. And I happened to mention that to some of our Japanese people that worked for us, and he said, "Oh, for goodness sakes, don't give him any yen, any money, because he is very rich. That's how he makes his money, is by begging." So they said I should tell him "otatoikoi," and I says, "Okay." I said, "What does that mean?" That before I took the language, but they said "otatoikoi" means go away and come back yesterday. And the Japanese language, that was interesting too. Mind you, I was in my 20s, and I took the Japanese lesson class because I figured if I knew the language, then I could tell if they were talking about me. So I talked that, and I learned the Japanese language. Well, now, 60 years later, I'm trying to learn Spanish, and it isn't working as well. But anyway, the Japanese use the vowels, A, E, I, O, U, in their language. And so they could not say mark. The closest they could come is maku. And Rasmussen, they have trouble with R's, so that was almost impossible. But they call it Maku di Rasmussen. So that was my name in Japan. I did learn how to write my name in Japanese, but I never learned how to write anything else but my name, because it was bad enough learning the language. And so I enjoyed that. So. Bless you. There was a compound within the confines of the city called the American Village. And in the American Village was the Army and the Air Force personnel that had brought their families, their children, or their wives over with them. And they would be billeted in the homes in the American Village. And in the American Village was the chapel. And I sang in the chapel for all the while I was there. And I think that's a picture of the chapel and also the choir that I sang in. I remember going and singing to the Japanese out in a park on Easter Sunday for Easter services, and got very well received. I'm sure that they probably couldn't understand the language, but the music is something that is universal, and people like music. In the evenings, we'd attend classes. I attended, of course, the Japanese class. I attended that. I attended the accounting class. I attended American history class. And the professor that was over there, they was all American, except for the Japanese. They were all American teachers that were over there and that would teach these classes. But the one that taught the American history class, I'll never forget him because he was so boring. His voice was monotone, and he never raised his voice. It was hard to understand him. But anyway, I did pass the class, but I don't know why. I was stationed in Japan for 3 years, and in that 3 years, only once did I take a 3-day pass, and that was to climb Mount Fuji. We got on an electric train and went to the bottom of the Mount Fuji, where there was a city by the name of Gotemba. And there's where you would start your travel up the mountain. You couldn't go straight up the mountain. Of course, you had to go this way up. It took us a half a day to get up to the one platform where we stayed overnight. It was just a big room with just a flat floor, nothing in it, no chairs, nothing. And we were going to stay there overnight. So we bedded down, and when I woke up during the night, the whole floor was full of people, because that was where they stayed overnight, because it took you almost 2 days to climb Mount Fuji. So in the morning, when we got up, I'll never forget, I know why they called Japan the land of the rising sun, because the sun was coming up, and I took pictures until I couldn't take pictures anymore, and they're all in slides, so I couldn't put any in here, but it was just gorgeous. And looking down the mountain, you could see the city of Gotemba, where we came from, and a lake that was over there. It was just absolutely beautiful. I considered Japan a land of taxis and bicycles. I'm sure it has changed now, because the pictures that I see on television, it's changed a lot. But back then, it was taxis and bicycles. And the average Japanese family didn't have a car. They had bicycles or took a taxi. And I remember in the mornings, you'd see people on bicycles or walking the street, going to the market to buy their meat and vegetables, because they didn't have refrigerators. So every day they would have to go and buy food. And that was something different to see too. And I remember the day we had an earthquake. I was on the 3rd or 4th floor, I don't remember which one, but I saw the chandeliers going like this. And I just stood and watched them. I didn't know what was going on. All the Japanese are underneath their desks. And they said, "You better get underneath the desk, it's an earthquake." So that was an experience. It wasn't a bad one. I don't think anything was damaged because of it, but it certainly made those chandeliers swim. I did study some of the religions over there, and I looked into the Buddhism and to Shintoism. Buddhists, of course, they worship Buddha. The Shintos, they had idols of, it could be a tree or a rock or something. So it was quite interesting to see what religions that they had. There were shrines all over. The Buddha would be a big cement one, or sometimes it was brass, and they would be so big that you could go up to it and climb into their hands and sit in it. They would be so big. And the Shintos would have a torii, which would be 2 poles up with a little, like a little roof over the top, and they'd be red. And so you knew that if you saw something like that, it was a Shinto shrine. And they had, we went to Nara Park, which was close by, and there was live deer all over the park. They never killed any of the deer. They didn't worship them, but they were there, and it was interesting to see the deer and that was there at the park. They roamed freely, and there were many festivals. I remember going to one that was, you could go drive along the river and watch the fishermen in their boats, but they were fishing with cormorants. You know, the cormorant is a duck, but it has a long neck, and so they would have the cormorants go and do the fishing for them, but they put a ring around the cormorant's neck so the cormorant could not could not swallow the fish. And then, of course, they'd take the fish away from the cormorant. And that was interesting. I had never seen that done before. The U.S. Iowa docked in Nagoya Harbor, and the military were told that they had certain hours that they would allow us to go on board ship and see that. And you see those big guns. They were so big that a man could crawl inside of them. They were huge. And of course, I had never seen something like that before, but it was interesting going to see that, and we took advantage of it. Weekends were usually free. I did work Monday through Friday, but sometimes Saturday I would have to work too. And So weekends were usually pretty free, and I got to know the missionaries. They would come to the chapel, and once a month, and all the missionaries around, American missionaries, and they would have a supper. And I got to know quite a few of the missionaries, and so I started working with them. And because I had learned the language, they asked me if I would teach a Japanese Sunday school class. Well, I did, but I didn't trust my tongue, because if you turn your tongue the wrong way, you can say the wrong thing. So I used an interpreter for the Sunday school class. Something that happened once a year, the 1st of May, was the communists would demonstrate and dance, snake dance down the streets. And we were told by our officers, don't monkey with them, don't interfere with them, just ignore them. And so we did see that the 1st of May every year. And evidently some of the Japanese people were wanting to be a communist, but it was interesting. We skipped away from them. And I mentioned about climbing Mount Fuji, but I forgot to mention that when you climb Mount Fuji, it's a volcano. And so I was wearing my brogans, and so when I finished my trip up and down from the volcano, I had to buy new brogans because that lava really cut my brogans up, and they were just in shreds. And I did get a post, well, I guess you'd call it like a cane. It was just a long stick, and they had different stations as you went on up, and you could have that station number burned into that wooden stake. And then at the top, you've got a little flag that said, and I think it was 11,000 feet high. I know I started feeling the effects of lack of oxygen when I got up there. But anyway, when you got to the top, they gave you that. And of course, it was a big, it was at least a mile across, the big hole in front of the volcano. But how were you going to send that long stick home? So I left it there. I didn't bring that home with me. Okay. I found the Japanese people to be very cordial, very kind, and I made quite a few friends over there. I had a secretary, her name was Jeannie, and she was my secretary. She answered the phone for me. She spoke English very well, and she would do some typing for me once in a while, but usually I had to do the typing for the contracts, but she would do the answering the telephone, and it was funny, you know, when they answered the telephone, it's mush mushy, anone. It was so much different that you didn't hear hello, you know. and for instance, the language, watakushiwa, it means I. It's about that long, watakushiwa. And watakushiwa nato wa esimasu. That means I like you. And that's the way that it is. Most foreign languages are like that. They put the nouns and the verbs in different places. So it was a challenge. If you were married, you only had to stay a year and a half. And at the time, I was not married, so I had to stay the 3 years. I found it very easy to shop. The Matsusakaya department store that was there was 2 stories high, and they had an escalator in it. And I thought that was something, you know, way back then in the 50s, to have an escalator in a department store. And we'd go to the department store and buy clothes because we could wear civilian clothes when we weren't on duty. And but it was sort of hard to find clothes that fit you because most of the Japanese are short. So, but once in a while, I was able to find a shirt or a pair of pants that would fit. I remember going to the Noritake China factory and touring that and watching them painting the china and then baking it. That was very interesting. I purchased a 54-piece set of Noritake china and sent it home because I knew I was getting married when I got home, and that would be a nice wedding present for my wife. And I also bought the wedding ring and the engagement ring in Japan. I sent the engagement ring to my wife, or to my fiance at the time, but I wore the wedding ring home on my finger. So, because you never knew, you know, there was a duty on it if you were caught with it. So, the fast trains, they were fast then, and they're even faster now. It was just an overnight trip to Yokohama or to Tokyo by train. I had to go to what they called Ofuna Depot, which was near Yokohama, to pick up supplies. When I first got there, I have to go overnight there and then watch them put the supplies for the PX into rail cars and seal it. And then I could come back, and then they would ship the thing back to me, to the PX. But they decided that they could trust the Japanese to do that too. So pretty soon we didn't have to do that anymore. And while I was there, I went over as occupational forces, and you could walk down the street and the Japanese would sort of just get out of your way as you walked down. But they were very wise, because as soon as they signed the paperwork making us security forces instead of occupational forces, the next day you were jostled along with everybody else. So it was sort of they were up on everything that was going on. Coming back to the United States, I went out through Seattle and going over. Coming back, I came around and came in at Seattle. And I remember it was snowing out in the bay just before you go into Puget Sound. It was snowing, and it snowed while I was in Seattle. And we caught a train to St. Paul, where my aunt lived, and it snowed all the way. I went through Glacier National Park, but all I saw was snow. But then we got to St. Paul and Minneapolis, and they had a snowstorm, so we were stranded in the Twin Cities for a couple of days before we could get out. And of course, I came back, and we had planned to get married then. So this was, got back in March, we got married in April. And then I still had a year for the Air Force, and I was being sent down to Biloxi, Mississippi, to Keesler Air Force Base. And so we got married, and my wife and I lived in Gulfport, Mississippi, because they didn't have room on base for us. So we had to get an apartment off base. And so we lived in Gulfport, which was 13 miles away. And I'll never forget that, because it was 13 miles against the sun in the morning and 13 miles against the sun coming home in the evening. But I found a back road that had a lot of trees, so I got rid of that. In Keesler Air Force Base, I worked in the Information and Education Center. We gave GED tests, we gave college level tests, and that usually was in the evenings, so I worked a lot of evenings while I was in Keesler Air Force Base. And while I was in Japan, like I said, I worked with the missionaries, and I got interested in the ministry. And in fact, I became a Christian in Japan. I had to travel 5,000 miles to find my Lord, but I did. And I decided to go into the ministry, and I ordered all the books I'd need for the first year of seminary. And then I ended up not going then when I got back and got out of services. But those books came in handy over the years. And eventually, 40 years later, I made it. Because in 2002, I was ordained into the ministry. And I use it as an example, because if you set a goal, don't give up on it. Keep going for it. And that will get you there. While I was in the Air Force, I received the Korean Service Medal, the United Nations Service Medal, the Good Conduct Medal, Japan Occupational Medal, and the National Defense Service Medal. And anybody who was ever on the Goya Air Base, we get together once a year for a reunion. And I have been in Columbus, Ohio, Manhattan, Kansas, Branson, Missouri, Rochester, Minnesota, Oklahoma City, California, North Carolina. Every year it's a different place. And we had over 300 people that would come to the reunions. And I went to the reunion in Des Moines this past May, and there was only 50 people, because people are getting older. And a lot of them are gone. Some of them can't travel anymore. But we're still getting together, the few of us that can get together. And there's pictures of the Nagoya Castle. The billets that I was in was inside of the moat of the castle. There was a moat all over around the castle. It was huge, and I don't know how many acres, but it was huge. The moat did not have water in it, because we had to go from our billets down into the moat and then up and to get to our mess hall. And so the helicopters that landed, they would come with an ambulance, and they'd go out the other way around, because they had cars and there was bridges to go across. But so it was very, but the Nagoya Castle was huge, and it was beautiful. It's, you can show the other one too if you want. Yeah. And they had little sheds like that you could buy your ticket to go touring in the castle if you want. I'm sure that those probably were used for guards at one time, but now it was being used for buying tickets.
Well, Mark, I really want to thank you for sharing your experience with us. And at this point, I'd like to open it up. Any questions that anybody has of Mark? And Jerry, have you got the mic? I don't know where Jerry went.
Yeah, if you have some questions, raise your hand.
And
We
Jerry,
have
I'll give you the mic.
over here. And when you get the mic, try to hold it as close to your mouth as you can. We can get better. We'll get a better reception with that.
Jerry, if you do us a favor,
Raise your hand again, please.
Jerry, would you repeat the question once you hear it?
I was just wondering, what was the weather extremes in Japan?
Good question. I had it in my notes, and I overlooked it. During the winter, we never got more than 3 inches of snow. And so we didn't have to worry about that part of it, but we did get a lot of rain during the years that I was there.
I want to know if you had to stay in that same place coming down Mount Fuji.
No, we didn't. We could go down faster than we went up.
Well,
That's why my brogans were all cut up, I'm sure.
When did you find out you didn't have to stop on the way down?
Well,
Once you got to the bottom?
you know, we just noticed that it was faster going down than it was
Jerry,
going up.
behind you, right there.
Could you give a number of earthquakes you've been in Japan?
Just one in Japan.
Okay.
Was there any animosity toward you being they were bombed out previously?
I felt none of it. No,
Really?
they were so
And did you
kind
see
and
some bombed out
so
areas?
glad that we were there.
Was there still, did you see some devastation yet?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you wear some kind of a uniform when you were working there?
We would wear a uniform whenever we were on duty. On weekends, we could wear civilian clothes, but...
I have a question, I guess, Mark.
Okay.
What I've heard and what I understand is that during the occupation, the Japanese were very, very friendly to the troops that were there. I mean, really to the point of obedience, if you will say. Can you comment on that just a little bit? I know you mentioned they were very nice.
Yeah. Well, whatever you ask of them, they would try to do their best to fulfill whatever your request was.
They're very proud people.
Yes, they are. And one thing I learned too, working with the missionaries, that if a Japanese person turned to Christianity, they were excommunicated from the family. They were not allowed to go back to their family. So those that did change and became Christians, they were strong Christians because they had to be.
Back in Europe.
Can you talk a little bit about how your Christian conversion came about?
I'm sorry, how much?
Can you tell us a little bit about how your Christian conversion came about?
Yeah, I was asked by a buddy of mine. He was going to a Bible study on Thursday night with the missionaries, and so he asked me to go along. And so I went along, and my family, my mother didn't drive. My dad would go fishing on Sundays, so I never went to church. And so this was all new to me. And so they did not push me at all into becoming a Christian, but we studied the Word. And one night I went to bed and I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. So I asked the Lord to show me. I woke up the next morning knowing exactly what I was going to do. And so I called the missionary and I said, I'd like to be baptized. And I said, Sunday would be fine. They said, no, we'll do it tonight. And so the missionaries that I worked with built their own home. And the man knew a lot about cars. And so he built his garage and he built an oil pit in the garage so that he could change the oil on his car. But he also made it a baptistry so that he could flood that oil pit. So I was baptized in an oil pit.
I was visiting with my friend Otto earlier and talking about the beginning of the Korean War. I didn't realize it started as quickly as it did after World War II. You saw it from its beginning, and I've grown up hearing about it, and we still see what a scary place that is between North Korea and South Korea.
Yeah.
Did you ever have any idea that it was going to continue to last so long? Was there a sense that this was going to be a short conflict? Have there been times in your life where you've seen that we've been closer to resolution? I can't see anything in my lifetime personally, but was there a time where it set in where you realized that this could be quite a while?
No, you know, I was glad when I was just a kid for the Second World War to quit. But then all of a sudden there was a Korean War, and you know, then it got to be I got a little scared that I'd have to go in, and but I never thought it would be as long as it was. But I didn't know much about Korea, and at that time, so it didn't make too much sense to me.
Korea had several masters.
Yeah. Well, one thing I didn't mention too was in Japan they have different dialects in different parts of Japan. just like we've got the southern drawl and the eastern, you know, and that sort of thing. But the emperor of Japan had 3 sons, and he gave a portion of Japan to each of the sons. So they had three different, and the sons didn't trust each other, so they changed the dialect. So what I learned in Nagoya, Japan, might not work in Tokyo. So now I don't know, it might be different now, probably has all mingled together and is together now, but back then there was a lot of difference between the languages within Japan.
Mark, have you had a chance to get back to Japan?
No, I wish I could. The reunions, a lot of people have gone back, but they said it has changed so much. And now even an apple is like $3. One apple, $3, or a glass of milk. Of course, now, you know, Japan was a land of mountains and rice paddies, and they didn't raise beef. They had to import their beef from Australia, so that made the beef quite expensive. And
Any other question?
Okay.
You mentioned that you were in Japan for 3 years. Did you not have any leaves? And how did you conduct your courtship? 3 years? It was probably
Okay.
letters, and you didn't have phones. and all
you're
this
getting
other
personal
stuff.
now. Well, I
Feel free to
sent
say.
a letter to my future father-in-law asking if I could marry his daughter. And he answered and he said yes. Then I sent a letter to his daughter and said, will you marry me? And when I got the letter back from her, I didn't have to open the letter because on the outside of the letter is yes, 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 yes.